everybody is coming. I'm so happy. My character is badass, but now dance to the ball.
This man didn't need wires. He didn't need CGI. He didn't need exaggerated close-ups or Hollywood polish to look powerful. When Tony Jaa moved, it was real. A blur of precision, balance, impact, and intent. There was a moment when the entire action world paused and asked the same question. Who is this? Because no one looked like him. No one moved like him. And no one else made pain look that beautiful. From dusty training grounds in rural Thailand to global screens, he arrived with something raw and undeniable. A new expression of martial arts cinema, one built on real contact, real risk, and the kind of control most performers only pretend to have. It felt like the birth of a new era, a new legend, a star who didn't just follow in the footsteps of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, but carved his own path, one elbow strike and flying knee at a time. But what rose suddenly did not rise again. Not the way it should have. Not the way the world expected, because somewhere between the breakout and the legacy, a system larger than one man began shaping the direction of his future. Decisions, contracts, timing, and the machinery of the film industry created barriers that talent alone could not break. This is the story of how Tony Jaa changed everything and why they never let him reach that height again. Tony Jaa's story begins far from film studios or martial arts schools with international reputations. He was born in a rural village in Surin, Thailand, where life was defined by work, daily routine, and the ability to endure. There were no stunt gyms, no structured performance training centers, no formal stage to prepare him for fame. But there was motion. There was the body. There was repetition. As a child, he watched martial arts films on a small screen and tried to imitate what he saw, not for attention, but out of fascination for what the human body could express. His influences were clear. Bruce Lee's precision, Jackie Chan's creativity, Jet Li's control. But Tony wasn't copying. He was learning how movement could become language. He began studying Muay Boran, the ancient predecessor of Muay Thai, a style built not just on strikes, but on full-body commitment. Every elbow carried weight. Every knee carried direction. It is a style that is practiced close, without wasted placement. In the environment Tony grew up in, martial arts were not a performance. They were a physical discipline tied to identity and respect. Training was daily, hard, repetitive. There was no shortcut to building the type of control that would later make audiences believe they were watching something almost unreal. His life changed when he was noticed by action choreographer and film director Panna Ridikrai. Ridikrai recognized something uncommon in Tony. Not just talent, but discipline. Many people can mimic a movement once. Tony could perform it the same way, with the same precision, every time. Ridikrai put him through a training regimen that intensified everything. Acrobatics, stunt work, falls, choreography, conditioning. This was not training for film. It was training to remove hesitation, to ensure that when the camera rolled, the movement would be automatic, unbroken, and truthful. Years of background stunt work followed. No spotlight, no leading roles, just preparation. That preparation led to the breakout, Ong-Bak. The film's production did not rely on visual effects to sell its martial arts. It relied on Tony Jaa himself. The camera stayed back. The takes were longer. The audience was allowed to see the entire body in motion. There were no edits designed to hide weaknesses because there were no weaknesses to hide. The action was not assembled in the editing room. It was captured live as it happened, with impact that was visible and felt. What made Ong-Bak different was not only the technique, but the honesty of the technique. There were no wires, no digital enhancement. The physical contact, the flips, the leaps, the airborne strikes, they were real, or as close to real as film could allow. Viewers around the world reacted immediately. because they were witnessing something they had not seen in years. Martial arts presented without cinematic cushioning. Tony Jaa did not look like someone performing fight choreography. He looked like someone who had lived inside the movement for his entire life. The film spread internationally through film festivals, internet clips, and word of mouth among action enthusiasts. What made it resonate was clarity. The viewer could see the strike begin, travel, and land in one continuous shot. Nothing was hidden. This level of readability is rare. It requires not only a skilled performer, but a production willing to frame the performer correctly. And in Ong-Bak, everything was built around showing Tony Jaa, not cutting around him. The follow-up work continued the same physical philosophy. Long takes, uninterrupted contact, stunt sequences structured like choreography on a stage rather than fragmented into short visual bursts. Tony Jaa was not just demonstrating skill. He was presenting an entire method. His approach combined the physical impact of Muay Baran with gymnastic elevation. His style carried a vertical dimension, climbing, jumping, launching himself into space, and returning to earth with intention. These movement choices became recognizable signatures. Around this time, Tony Jaa's name became synonymous with the revival of practical martial arts cinema. Not revival by nostalgia, but revival by demonstration. He didn't reference earlier martial arts legends. He lived the physical discipline that had made them iconic. Because of that, comparisons were inevitable. But as his work expanded, something became clear. Tony Jaa was not stepping into another person's lineage. He was establishing a new one. The global recognition that followed placed him in a position few martial arts performers reach. The intersection between national cinema and international expectation. His performances were admired not only by audiences, but by stunt teams and choreographers worldwide who saw in him a level of physical fluency that demanded respect. For a moment, the industry paused to see where he would go next. The assumption was upward: larger roles, larger productions, global expansion. The rise happened quickly. The foundation was solid. The skill was real. The presence was undeniable. Everything suggested a long, continued ascent. But the environment around him would change faster than the style that made him a phenomenon. The cameras would change. The editing norms would change. The expectations of global studios would shift, and not all of those shifts would move in his favor. The question, then, is not whether Tony Jaa's talent faded. It did not. The question is how the space around that talent shifted, and why the rise that should have continued slowed. The turning point in Tony Jaa's rise did not come from a decline in skill or a shift in his dedication. It came from changes in the environment surrounding him, the expectations of larger markets, the influence of international studios, and the shift in how modern action films were constructed. At the time Tony Jaa emerged, action cinema globally was moving in a different direction. Editing styles were becoming faster. Fight scenes were being shaped to highlight pace over clarity, impact over continuity, spectacle over readability. The choreography remained important, but the camera began to play a larger role in creating the illusion of movement, rather than simply capturing it. Tony's style required the opposite. It required patience from the camera. It required space in the frame. It required trust in the performer. His approach was built on long sequences of uninterrupted movement, where the audience could see how a strike started and how it ended. But in many global film environments, action was shifting toward coverage-heavy editing, multiple angles, rapid cuts, close-ups to emphasize force, and visual rhythm constructed in post-production rather than in the performance itself. This shift did not align with Tony's approach. And when the filming style does not match the performer's method, the result is that the performer's strengths are not fully seen. As Tony's reputation grew, opportunities opened outside Thailand. Larger productions began to take interest. But with larger productions came competing creative structures, additional producers, different types of directors, and marketing considerations that did not always prioritize the preservation of physical authenticity. Many global action films of the time relied on editing to create intensity, rather than letting intensity originate from the movement itself. Tony's movement did not require enhancement. But enhancement is often the default in the industry, especially when the pressure to fit a specific cinematic tone is high. At the same time, Tony carried responsibilities beyond acting. His growing fame placed pressure on him to lead productions in ways that stretched his capacity. The films that followed Ong-Bak sought to build on his success by increasing scale and expectation. Larger stunts, more complex narratives, and rising international attention all accumulated around him. The result was not a reduction in quality, but an increase in demands. Managing those demands required coordination structures that were still developing around him. During this period, the global martial arts film landscape was also evolving. Other regions were introducing new artists, new filmmaking styles, and new hybrid action approaches. Wire-assisted movement, CGI enhancement, and stylized framing became more common. Tony's method remained grounded in direct physical expression. This made him stand out, but it also meant that integrating into these evolving styles required careful collaboration. Without that collaboration, the work could be shaped in ways that did not represent the full extent of his ability. When Tony eventually moved into international roles, the shift became more visible. In ensemble films with many leading characters, his presence was included, but not centered. His abilities appeared in brief sequences, moments that stood out, but did not define the structure of the film. These roles introduced him to global audiences, but they did not allow the full expression of his movement style. His scenes were shorter. The camera framing was tighter. The editing was faster. The result was visibility, but not the kind of visibility that builds legacy momentum. This type of role placement is common for martial arts performers entering large-scale productions. They are included because their physical skill is recognized, but the films are not built around their performance language. In Tony's case, the difference was noticeable. When he starred in films where the choreography and camera were designed to highlight his style, the presence was unmistakable. When placed in roles where the camera structure did not adapt to him, the result was restrained impact. None of this indicates that Tony's rise stopped due to ability. His physical control, timing, and expressive technique remained. The question was whether the industry environments he stepped into provided the space necessary for those qualities to be seen. When a performer's core method relies on clarity of movement, but the filming method relies on fragmentation for energy, a disconnect emerges. That disconnect does not diminish the performer. It shapes the perception of the performance. Despite this, Tony's reputation did not fade among those who study movement, choreography, or stunt design. His influence continued in martial arts communities, film schools, and analysis channels dissecting technique. His early films remained reference points for what uncut, physically grounded martial arts cinema could achieve. The conversation around him became less about whether he still had the ability and more about whether the industry would create another environment that allowed his performance language to be presented in its full form. The rise paused, not because Tony changed, but because the framework around him shifted. The talent stayed. The discipline stayed. The physical truth stayed. What changed was the cinematic space afforded to it. The next stage of his story would depend on whether that space could be found again. The idea that Tony Jaa did not rise again does not come from a loss of ability or a decline in dedication. It comes from how the industry around him changed and how that change shaped the roles he was offered. When the global action market shifted toward high-speed editing, layered stunt doubles, and visual effects-driven spectacle, the environment no longer framed Tony's strengths the way his earlier films did. His style required space, a stage built for the body to carry the scene. Without that space, the movement that once felt undeniable began to appear contained. not because it was weaker, but because the frame around it was different. Studios outside of Thailand recognized Tony Jaa's talent, but many did not understand how to build a film around him. Instead of structuring scenes that allowed extended physical expression, his appearances became concentrated into short segments. A few kicks, one fight sequence, a single showcase moment. Then the film moved on. This approach introduced him to new audiences, but it did not build narrative weight around him. He became a highlight performer rather than the axis of the story. In ensemble casts, he was positioned as a side presence, noticeable but not central. The audience could see his skill clearly, but not long enough for it to define the film. At the same time, the action world began to reward styles different from Tony's. Wire-assisted movement allowed for gravity-defying spectacle. Quick-cut editing created the impression of intensity without requiring visible technique. CGI enhancements could add speed, power, and force without the need for precise physical control. These methods expanded the possibilities of action cinema, but they also changed audience expectations. Movement became something created in post-production rather than captured in performance. For someone whose work is built entirely on real-time execution, this shift was significant. Tony did not chase these trends. He did not reshape his movement to match the new pace. He continued to perform the way he always had: grounded, direct, controlled. His commitment to real contact and full-body storytelling did not change. And because the industry did not adjust to him, the opportunities that maintained his international momentum became limited. The environment favored flexibility in framing, not excellence in movement. However, this does not mean Tony's influence faded. Among choreographers, stunt teams, and physical performers, his work remains foundational. The techniques demonstrated in his early films continue to be studied for their clarity, precision, and efficiency. The sequences that defined Ong-Bak and its successors remain reference points for how martial arts can be translated authentically on screen. The impact did not disappear. It simply moved into different parts of the industry. Training spaces, action design teams, performance schools, and analytical discussion. There is also an important distinction between visibility and relevance. Visibility depends on marketing cycles, release schedules, and mainstream attention. Relevance depends on whether the work still matters to the craft. Tony Jaa's relevance has never left. What changed was where that relevance was displayed. In more recent years, there has been renewed recognition of the value of physical authenticity in action cinema. Long-take choreography has returned in certain films. Directors have become more interested in showcasing actual fighting skill without disguising it behind editing. There is a growing audience that wants to see what bodies can really do, rather than what software can simulate. In this environment, Tony's style aligns more closely with current interest than it did during the peak of CGI-dependent action. The potential for resurgence exists because the ability never diminished. The question has always been whether the film environment would shift to meet the performer, rather than the performer shifting to meet the environment. When a film is built around Tony Jaa, when the camera gives him space, when the choreography is designed for clarity, when the scene is allowed to play out without fragmentation, the effect is the same as it was at the beginning. The body speaks. The movement carries meaning. The impact is unmistakable. The phrase, "They never let Tony Jaa rise again," reflects the role of systems, not individuals. Industries favor formats that can be replicated quickly. Tony's style cannot be replicated without the time, planning, and filming discipline that his method requires. His rise paused because the system around him favored speed over patience, not because his skill diminished. The legacy he holds is not mysterious. It is visible in every elbow strike, every leap, every frame where the body moves without interruption. He showed that martial arts cinema does not need illusion to be powerful. It needs honesty. He proved that a performer can become the story by embodying it physically, without explanation or exaggeration. The next chapter, if it comes, will not require reinvention. It will require the same thing that made the first rise possible. A camera willing to stay still long enough to let the movement speak. Tony Jaa did not fall. The world around him changed. The rise simply waits for the right frame again.